Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Matt McInnes Watson, Mr. Plyometrics. I've been looking forward to this podcast for a little while now, as plyometrics is something that I'm very keen to learn more about myself, and I think they have a massive benefit to everyone, no matter what your sport is. So in this episode, we go deep on why plyometrics are so beneficial. We go into details on what they actually are and are not. We give you some tips on how to start building them into your training once you've appreciated how amazing they are, and also some ways to categorize them if you're a coach and how to progressively overload them sensibly. There's a ton of incredible information in this podcast, so I really hope you enjoy it as much as Rob and I did. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check out the website if you would like to learn more about movement mechanics. wit-fitness.com, use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase, and Hytro, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Right, let's get into it. Matt, welcome to the show. How are you doing today, mate?
Yeah, all good. Ready, gearing up for maybe a few days off over Christmas, which is well and truly needed. But it's I think we all get to that stage of the year where we're like, we need to force ourselves to take a couple of days and chill. So yeah, looking forward to that, and what's to come in 2023.
Brilliant. And for the listeners who might not know much about you, other than you're the Plyo Guy, could you give us a brief intro to who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So I always tell people I'm a high jumper at heart. That was my sport, and I haven't actually competitively high jumped for 7 or 8 years, maybe not 6 or 7 years, but still see myself as a high jumper. It's just built into me, and I'll always tell people that. I kind of see myself as a failed one as well. I should have, would have, could have sort of mentality to it. But yeah, that in essence has shaped kind of my path and the people that I interact with and coach, and it kind of led me into the jumps world of coaching Plyos, and being kind of mentored in the track and field realm, and getting just a love for dynamic movement, and that's kind of led me to a stage where I'm now doing a PhD in plyometrics, and it's very kind of geared towards my experiences and my kind of, I guess, through my mentorship from my coach in high jump, and his influences from kind of Polish sector of training, which kind of has a bit of a crossover with Russian style stuff back in the 60s and 70s. And, that's if we're to look back at plyometric research, that ultimately is kind of the forefathers of plyometrics as well. So it's kind of led for me to kind of dig into research for plyometrics, and now I'm at a stage where I'm kind of looking at the way that I coach it and trying to develop research around that. And that kind of meets well with what I do in terms of coaching and consulting with people from all different types of sports, whether they're professional, Olympic, or complete amateurs, from sports like parkour all the way through to bobsleigh and track and field. And honestly, the list has kind of grown over the last few years, where I've tried to increase my presence online. I mean, working with people in Olympic lifting, that's been a real interest over the last few, I'd say the last 6, 7, 8 months has really grown. And I think the best part about it is that it constantly challenges the systems and my beliefs around things. And it's a constant learning curve for me, diving into different sports and having to learn and understand that principles of movement, they marry across so many different sports, and how we do things, we can learn a hell of a lot from different people in different areas. So that's it's been really, really an interesting couple of years when it comes to that, because of, I think my bias in track and field is it always tends to lead me in a certain direction, and when I get pulled in a different direction, I'm like, wow. And I think doing all the surrounding stuff really gives me a lot more skills to actually improve what I'm doing in track and field, which is my first love. So I'm kind of in a place where it's like everything is coming in from all different directions when it comes to consulting with people and coaching people. But ultimately, it's becoming something that I really, really enjoy doing. And yeah, it's gradually kind of expanding what we're doing within our business in terms of the programs that we offer and stuff. So yeah, it's been a great couple of years, and we're at a point now where we're starting to do a few more seminars and stuff, which is nice, kind of post-COVID, and doing more face-to-face stuff, because I think teaching dynamic movement on a screen is so in comparison to when you're doing things face-to-face and people are understanding like this is how you should be moving, or this is how athletes should be moving. It kind of opens their eyes to things a little bit more.
Amazing. So you were a high jumper, obsessed with jumping higher, and as you got to the later stages of your high jump career, you wanted to learn more and more about the whys and the hows of doing that. And I guess you just took on a lot of expertise until you started then being that teacher yourself to teach others to learn more. What was it originally about high jump? Were you just naturally very good at it and then wanted to be even better, or was there something particular about jumping?
So the funny part of it is that I didn't start high jumping until I was 18. And the reason why I didn't is because my best friend went to the national championships when we were at school. So it was like, well, he does high jump, so I'll do a bit of triple jump, and I hurdled a bit at school. But this was whilst I was playing football. I played football from as young as I can remember up until the age of kind of 18, 19, where I was doing a little bit of both football, high jump, and I was playing basketball. But I got into high jump through basketball. So I started to gain some friends when I left school, and I was in sixth form college, and one of them was playing basketball. And there's a national academy set up in Southampton, where I'm from, that is linked to the college that I went to. One of the guys, you should come along. You're 6'3". Maybe you could dunk a basketball. So yeah, one of my friends had kind of pushed me to try a dunk. I dunked first time just out of pure luck. They were like, right, you need to come and play for the basketball team. I'm like, okay. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was reasonably athletic. And I didn't realize I was reasonably athletic in terms of a jumping sense, because when you're tall, people are like, oh, it's just because you're tall, that's the reason why you jump high. Little did I know that there was some transfer to that. I was forced to kind of go down to a track and field meet for the college, and later on in the year, did pretty well in the high jump, had no idea what I was doing, and walked down to a local track with my head of sport from my college and met the guy that's been my mentor for 14 years. And he was my coach for the whole of my high jump career and stuff. Walked across a guy that was a Canadian fella that, had coached world championship athletes, Commonwealth Games medalists, and just one of those moments where you just meet that person that ultimately has probably changed the way that, not the way that I was kind of influenced by jump stuff, but ultimately has shifted my perspective on so much in terms of how I learn, how I want to be a lifelong learner. He still does dynamic training, and he's 73 or 74. So awesome. It's pretty inspiring. And from that, my love for stuff, I think, has grown because of the way that he influenced me, really.
Amazing. Such a cool story. Before we get too far, I definitely want to ask more questions on the Polish and other forefathers of plyometrics. But I think the first thing we need to get clear on for the listeners is, what is the definition of a plyometric?
So I'm getting to a stage now where I try to simplify it as much as possible. So a plyometric to me, and I think to everyone it should start to become this, is a movement where there is a landing and a takeoff action to a fast or dynamic movement. There aren't that many things that you could say are not plyometric and fit within that terminology. You could say, oh, well, there are like fast feet patterns that potentially aren't plyometric. There are, you could dance and be landing and taking off, and it not be plyometric in inverted commas. But if there is a relative displacement of the body, so you are shifting, the center of mass of a body from one point to another, and that could be 1 meter, 3 meters, 5 meters, whatever. and it's relatively quick, and you have that landing and takeoff portion, I class that as plyometric. I see that there is a lot of nuance to people wanting to make sure that it is within a certain time frame, and I get that, and I understand the depth of the research and why we want to promote that, because when we do have a faster complete ground contact time, I know that we tap into a lot more of the tendon, and the tendon is what gives us a recoiling action that ultimately makes dynamic movement reflexive in nature and not necessarily muscular effort driven. It's very much more kind of built within our nature, of how we're built as humans to deflect off of the ground when we move. The reason why we don't move like cats is because we're on 2 feet, and cats jump the way that they do because they're on 4 limbs. And I often hear that, to jump and land like a cat, but we don't have the physiology that a cat does. So I would argue that we don't want to move like a cat at all. Obviously, we'd love to jump as far or be able to control our bodies like a cat does, but we don't have a tail as long as our torso to do so, and we don't walk around on our hind legs and stuff like that. So we have to look at what we're effective at as humans, and I think then we maximize what we can do, and I really think that is at the forefront of what I try to promote when I look at plyometrics, is using our natural tendencies, and tapping into them and really pushing them through kind of a hyperdrive focus of saying, I want to maximize how well we use our tendons and the free energy that we can create from those tendons. So if it's fast, honestly, if it looks fast to the eye, the likelihood is that it's plyometric. And if there's relative displacement to it, the likelihood is that the loading within the ground contact is relatively high. So when we sprint, we have data to suggest that at maximal sprinting, if you're moving close to kind of 9 meters per second, you're getting up over 4 or 5 times body weight in that landing, which is exponential loading. You're never going to experience that in a gym setting. But we understand that if it's done within a very short time frame, we can handle that load, and we can pull on the tendon because the load is so high and because it's so fast. So that's how I'd look at it. Landing, takeoff portion, relatively fast.
Great. I love that. And I don't want to get too pedantic, but speed is one of the defining factors of plyometrics. But even in walking, there's ground contact and takeoff. So would you say that is, or does that still qualify as plyometric for somebody who's very deconditioned, for example? There is obviously that impact component.
So yeah, there ultimately is a crossover if we're to look at the differences between like walking and jogging, and that is based upon whether you are airbound or not. So when you walk, there is always one limb on the floor, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But when you jog or run or sprint or do plyometric actions, there is a complete airborne phase to that. And what that does is it spikes the ground reaction force, tenfold sort of thing in comparison to when you're walking. You're probably playing around the realms of between 1.2 and 1.4 kind of times body weight. If you're to really start moving, you're going to push over kind of 1.5. But then ultimately what you see straight away is that, like, when you try to mess around and like practice power walking, and we've all kind of messed around with that sort of thing, what you start to do is you start to become airbound, and you start to run, and ultimately it's changing in power walking or speed, whatever the phrase is, speed walking, power walking. It's changing the rules because they are becoming airborne, because the old rules used to be that you had to have 1 foot planted on the ground at all times, but you actually slow it down, you're like, these guys are airbound. It's because of what? Because they're using more tendon-based movement, so they have more of an air time to it, so that they can whip the foot down harder, create a larger ground reaction force, and propel their body further into space. Ultimately, what we want to do, we want to do it quicker, we want to displace our body faster and further. So that is the that is the difference between walking and running, and that's where running would be seen as more plyometric in nature. The difference between running and sprinting is the time on the ground and how much that influences the use of the tendon, basically.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think for me, everything involves an element of that, obviously stretch shortening cycle for any efficient movement. So the reason that we got in touch was that I was talking to Chris Speed about this, and he obviously pointed me in your direction because I think they're massively underappreciated, and it's something that I would love to learn more about. So came direct to the source. What do you think it is? So we've touched on a couple of things there around use of free tendinous recoil, let's say. Why is it, but one, why are plyometrics so beneficial, and two, why are they not used as often as you or I think they should be?
Yeah, I mean, it does relates back to what I spoke about, and that it's built into how we want to move as humans. We don't want to move slowly. We want to move efficiently in a fast manner. And I spoke about this to someone yesterday, and that why are coaches using like a stopping action in a lot of their plyos? Why do they do like a freeze frame and hold a landing? And why do I not do so much of that? And my opinion is that it's inherently quite different to plyometrics, but at the same time, I think a lot of us don't want to do that action. We're not necessarily built to stop on a dime. If you watch the best people to watch are parkour athletes, and you see how they roll out of everything. You see the best athletes in the world, like going back to things like dunking a basketball. When you watch a guy running down the court and they dunk, they don't dunk and then land perfectly. They amble out of it and they roll out of it, and that's ultimately because we are so effective at spreading load like that. Taking an extra few steps, being able to be as efficient as possible when it comes to falling down from a height, whether it's rolling out of a certain movement where we're trying to keep our body as safe as possible. We're trying to offload certain joints as much as possible when we can afford to do so. And I think plyometrics also has that side to it. And the reason why people don't teach it is because plyometrics are yet to be seen, I think, in this light. They're not teaching us to be efficient movers. I actually think plyometrics has the biggest impact in things like endurance running. And people will ask me about, do plyos influence endurance running and 10Ks, half marathons? And I say, well, yeah, because you have 5,000 opportunities to do well. When I'm talking to a high jumper, they have one opportunity to maximize everything. And efficiency of running and locomotion in general, if you're able to improve that by being faster on the ground and applying more force in that shorter time frame, then in things like a 10K where let's say you take 5,000 steps, and I'm able to grow your stride by 5 centimeters or knock off 0.02 of a second, well, you're probably going to take 2 minutes off your 10K time by doing plyometrics and not doing more mileage. And people were like, what? Like, that's the potential that you have by being more effective and more efficient as a mover. And it could be the same as, if you've got a footballer on a pitch or a rugby player, a basketball player. Well, if the 10,000 different little footsteps that you take within a game are more efficient because you've been working on those landing mechanics and technical elements of that potentially gives you maybe fresher legs towards the end of the game. It gives you that opportunity to beat an opponent by an inch as you drive around them or as you take them on. That, I think, movement efficiency is where it has its largest impact. There's the assumption that it is all geared towards like the power output side of like the top of the pyramid, where we get that kind of cherry on top. Of course it does have that impact, but everything underneath it, that is the reason why we've got this person with such a high performance ceiling, is because of what we've done previously. We've made them more effective at moving. We've made them more efficient. We've made sure that they're less injury prevalent because they are stiffer when they land. And that ultimately is where I think where people are missing the boat a little bit. But there's starting to be a change in the education of things, but that's where I think it has the largest effect and where people are missing things out, really.
Brilliant. You just said something there which I really liked, and I think it might surprise some people to phrase it like that, in terms of being stiffer when they land, and that's good for injury prevention. Could you talk about that in a little bit more detail, please?
Yeah, so stiffness is talked when you do hear people talk about plyometrics, they'll talk about stiffness, and I think stiffness is twofold in that you're looking to build tendon stiffness and you're looking to build joint stiffness. To me, tendon stiffness is more of a physiological thing where you're looking to improve the lengthening and shortening action of that tissue. So if that tendon is stiffer, you're playing around. Imagine you had a loose elastic band. You've got to really pull on it and it will snap back a bit slower. But if I've got one that's made of this special material that you have to apply unbelievable, like 5 of you have to pull on it really hard and really fast, but it pings 100 meters down the road, that's ultimately where we'd want to see a tendon be. So the tendon stiffness is, as I said, is that physiological side of things, whereas joint stiffness is, I'd say, more of a neuromuscular or neurological thing where we're trying to get the whole of the surrounding part of that joint, of all the networks and baskets of muscles and tendons and how they interlink and all that tissue, has to sing together at the right time, and they have to be prepared for ground contact. So they have to be coming into ground ready to stabilize. They have to be readily activated before you've hit the ground. When you hit the ground, they have to then all brace at the same time, and then you have to be able to kind of utilize the energy that's come in from that movement and transfer it out of that movement. So stiffness is basically about you being able to pivot over a foot more effectively rather than dropping down into a movement and yielding more at a joint or flexing more at a joint and losing all that energy and that dispersing into the ground. If you were to jump out of a first story window, you would disperse at the joint. You would reduce at joints, flex heavily at them because you don't want to pop out of that movement. Because if you're trying to be stiff from that kind of extreme height, then things just explode and you'll have no tendons left. So that's why you see parkour athletes roll out of things, because they're trying to spread the energy. We want to pinpoint that energy and use it as our that kind of Dragon Ball Z kind of explosion sort of thing. So we use plyometrics to blunt the inhibitions in our body to flex around a joint. We are built to do that. We are built to flex, compress. Even our spine will compress and you'll sink over your legs, even if you were to kind of just compress vertically as opposed to compressing horizontally and rolling out of it. Ultimately, everything is going to want to flex, disperse the energy, take it over multiple muscles across the body rather than being stiff, rigid, and popping off of the movement, which we want to do when we're just doing basic ground movement. So that's kind of where stiffness lies for me in terms of the physiological side and the neuromuscular side or neurological side. You have to have the tendon stiffness and that physiology needs to be there, but you also have to have the skill component of being able to marry everything up, have all of those compounding kind of contributors to sing together at the right time so that you can ultimately move more effectively.
Matt, is there a trade-off to be made there with the stiffness, in that you might make it harder for somebody to access more extreme ranges of motion? I'm thinking more about the weightlifters, where if you're asking the tendon to not lengthen as much, so you can have a shorter ground contact time, will that limit their ankle dorsiflexion, for example?
Ultimately, if you live in a lot more kind of overcoming stiffer based movements, that's going to train the body to be like that. So the way that I will structure my plyometrics and kind of surrounding jumping movements is that I will always use a yielding form of movement that I call like a deep range of motion form of kind of
Sorry to interrupt.
plyos.
Can I just interrupt
Sorry.
you there and for the listeners, just define yielding and overcoming, because it's not, I don't think it's as commonplace as it should be.
Yes. Sorry. So overcoming is what we've just spoken about. It's being stiff. It's overcoming that force in terms of like, you don't want to flex and reduce at the joint. You want to overcome those forces, deflect off of the ground as fast as possible. Yielding is the complete opposite. We want to control that movement into a deeper range. Exactly. I mean, you could, if you're looking at in a lifting perspective, it's looking at things like a power clean as opposed to like a full clean. You want to catch it at the top as opposed to catching things at the bottom. Obviously, you can't say one's better than the other with regards to with regards to lifting, because ultimately you'd want to be catching it at the bottom, and people are a lot stronger, and that's because of the speed of the movement. It's slow in comparison to a landing and takeoff action. If you want to be more effective in a plyometric, overcoming and being better in an overcoming action is far more effective. For other things, yielding and more joint range of motion is ultimately where you want to be, especially within lifting parameters. So I'll use a spectrum of different movements, of different overcoming movements, different yielding based movements, so that we don't have a huge bias towards it. But when I say overcoming, it depends on what sport you're within. So if I'm working with a track and field athlete, they'll be doing a lot more overcoming based stuff with a little sprinkle of deeper range of motion yielded actions. If you are a lifter, you're going to be doing a lot more yielded based movement, and you're going to be doing a lot more at deeper ranges, kind of oscillatory, kind of in and out bounces they're not plyometric per se, in inverted commas, but they will have a landing and takeoff action to them, and they do complement each other really well, I found. So it's all about the sport. It's all about how much dosage you'll get at certain ends of that spectrum of yielding and overcoming actions. And I think ultimately, if you've got a bit of both, no matter how much, you're still able to, I'd say, manipulate the body at any given point to do what you've kind of asked for it to do. And I think it gives you those abilities to switch between both. You're always going to have a preference. And I have athletes, even within the same sport, that have a preference to be more yielded and action, a specific joint as opposed to more overcoming at a joint when they're doing, let's say they are a high jumper. You're going to get slower high jumpers and you're going to get faster high jumpers. That's always the way. And the slower high jumpers, it might be that you find a preference in doing more yielded action as opposed to overcoming action. And it could be vice versa. You could find that when your athlete is just so highly wired, everything's really fast and stiff, doing some yielded stuff is actually the bit that really just brings the program together. And it can be the same for lifters. Someone that just will not catch at the bottom of a movement, using certain things is going to stimulate. So doing more yielded based jumping movements could be a way for them to build confidence. And talking about Chris, I think we have gone exactly into that. How do we build confidence at the bottom end of range, when instead of chucking a bar on your back and trying to do things at the bottom, like we've been bringing in forms of overload, but with the velocity end of things, rather than an external overload on your back or wherever you want to hold that load, whether it be a bar or dumbbells or whatever. But using velocity as the overload rather than external weight is another way for you to build confidence in that, because most of the time it is a confidence thing. When you've got someone that's really stiff and that will not yield, they won't drop down into those deeper ranges. On the flip side, when you've got someone that just wants to be in those deeper ranges all the time, it's not so much a confidence thing, but it's just a pattern of being able to stiffen around the joint. So you have to then do more overcoming stuff, and it becomes more of a skill parameter then that they have to develop over time.
That's really cool. I think that ties in perfectly with a concept. I did a course years and years ago called neural notching, and it's basically a term applied to favorable muscle length that any individual tends towards. So if somebody is used to doing shallow overcoming jumping, they like that small amount of stretch in the muscle before they spring off. Where if somebody tends towards more hypermobile, they prefer longer muscle lengths. To get that rebounding action, they need to have a greater length in the muscle. So that's more like a yielding type person. And the concept is basically they're all skills. It's just like a preference. So it's called notching, like a notch on your belt, in that everyone has a favorite one that they like to go to, but you can create a new one by training the ability to go into a certain length and return from it again and again, which is exactly what you and Chris are doing with those like deep squat patterns, where you just practice turning around at that given point, and not only getting the physiological conditioning, but also the neurological skill of the movement, which I think is an awesome way to bring that in for people who perhaps don't like a certain position. So that's super cool to see.
Yeah.
Awesome. And one of the things that I love about the way you deal with plyos, Matt, is your categorization. So it gives a lot of structure around how to progressively overload them. Could you give the listeners a bit of insight into how you break down plyometrics into their various types?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, that have dug into plyometrics over the last few years will have realized that that it tends to be the two ends of the spectrum of an intensive or maximal based plyometric, and then a submaximal and extensive form of plyometrics. And it works, it's effective for certain people. I personally like to have a little bit more detail to that in that I have 4 tiers, and it is a range of, as I mentioned before, of overcoming versus kind of yielded based actions. But you could kind of sit the yielded actions outside of those plyometric rounds because of the speed of it. But the 4 tiers, if I look at the most intensive tier, which is what I class as our maximal base tier, which is, I call it ping. And that's because that's the kind of nuance that I want athletes to experience, is to ping off the floor. And that's being as stiff as possible on the ground, being as fast as possible on the ground, and being as dynamic as possible. And you're trying to exert, as much effort up into the air. And when I say effort, I mean you're just trying to pop off the ground and get as much height as possible, or as much distance as possible. And then if we move down into the submaximal category, or the extensive category, then we've got what I class as our medium tier, which is, there's not maximal intent to it, but you are still in an overcoming kind of world, in that you are trying to move off the foot fast. You are using a lot more locomotive based movement. So like relaxed bounding is a great way to look at it. The ground contact time is relatively fast, but you're still relaxed maybe in your upper body. You're not kind of grunting movements out of it. But you still have a relatively high ground reaction force because of it. And then kind of right underneath that is what I class as our light tier, which is a step down again in terms of intensity, where things are very kind of rudimentary, and you'll find that the athlete is again super relaxed, and you can bring in loads of different kind of external stimulus when you're doing light tier movements, where you might be holding a med ball. You can kind of tract your arms from it, put them overhead, whatever it might be. It's very light on the ground, as the tier kind of suggests. The ground contact time we like to keep relatively fast, but the ground reaction forces, there's no real push for you to be able to displace your center of mass there. It's very kind of almost like you're bouncing on your feet, kind of similar to what you do with like skipping rope stuff. And then our deep tier is our yielded based tier of jumping actions. When I say jumping actions, is because they're not plyometric, but you do have a landing and takeoff based action to them. And that is just deep ranges of motion. Things like skater bounds, where you're really absorbing into one side, popping back out of it, absorbing onto the other leg, letting that other leg kind of come behind. You've got deep range at the knee, hip, and ankle there. And that really is our kind of complementary supporting tier that I find just really holds up the other three really well. And that's ultimately how I'll attack most programs that I design, is using all four of those tiers at all points within a given year, and just making sure that I am always touching upon them so that we're kind of leaving no leaf kind of, that they're not left behind, and that we're keeping people kind of safe from injury because we're doing all of those parts of that system.
Amazing. And I think the two questions people have will be, what would be some examples of, we had skipping for the light stuff, but could you give us some examples of the other three, and then talk about how somebody might get started? Because I think a lot of people are going to be inspired to add more plyometrics into their training after this podcast. And if somebody's been lifting a lot of weight for a long time but not exposing themselves to these dynamic forces, what would your advice be for starting to build them in?
Yeah. So I think your light tier is going to be really impactful for bridging the gap of you not doing any or much plyometrics before. So having a background of building up a good volume of lower leg, just more of a lower leg capacity to be able to handle more landings and contacts in general. And your light tier stuff can be as basic as doing some bilateral leaps. So kind of as if you were to jump rope. The difference between jump rope and skipping as opposed to the light tier stuff is just the foot positioning. I like to tend to get people to land a little bit more on a full foot, rather than jump rope tends to be quite high up on the forefoot. So it could be just 2 foot leaps forward. You could be doing them backwards. You can do a bit laterally, and then you can change the stance of that. If you're a lifter, especially if you're an Olympic lifter, doing some split stance stuff is really preferable. And you could be doing just holding a split stance and moving forward, again, backwards, sideways, however you want to look at it. And then you can move into an exchanging form of that movement as well, where the front leg moves to the back and the back leg moves to the front. And again, you can do that on the spot, or you can move forward, laterally, backwards. And realistically, that can be the starting blocks of the light tier, is using some bilateral movements. And then over time, you can introduce some bounding, so from right to left kind of motion on one leg. And then at the end, it could be that you bring in more hopping actions where you're just using one limb to move. And realistically, let's say that you did forward motion, backwards motion, and lateral motion, and you're just doing 2 foot leaps, in a standard stance. You could do 2 sets of those 3 to start you off, just to get a feel for what these movements feel like. What does it feel like? Is it a real shock to me, or is it like, oh, I'm pretty good at this? This actually feels pretty easy and natural when I lap up kind of, let's say, 20 contacts of each of those movements, and I'm doing 2 sets of them. Well, straight away, you've done 120 light movements or light landings there, which is a nice little start and a nice little stimulating kind of addition to what you might already be doing. And that could be part of your warm-up for lifting. You want to do a bit of plyometrics in your training? Do it in your warm-up. Stop doing bar mobility, because I know that there's such a need for doing that, is getting in, making sure you're doing your bar mobility stuff. Well, I've been saying this to Chris: get them in, do some light tier plyos and do some deep tier plyos. I can guarantee you're getting plenty of mobility out of the deeper tier stuff as well, but you're also spending your time doing something that's going to ultimately probably have a much larger impact. Rather than spending 20 minutes trying to mobilize your body, you could be spending 15 minutes doing plyos, and then you just speed up what you're doing with your mobility and stop chatting. So it's always there.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So yeah, you ultimately are going to want to do the light tier and the deep tier to start with. And the deep tier, you're probably going to do half the kind of number of landings that you'll do in the light tier, because they're just so much more muscularly effort driven, and it's going to deplete you quite quickly. So doing, again, bilateral stuff, moving forward, go through deep ranges of motion, landing like a squat pattern that's comfortable for you. Let your ass kind of drop into that deeper motion, and doing them forwards and laterally, a bit backwards. You're probably going to find backwards stuff quite difficult.
Yeah.
But also start to play with a split stance. if you're a lifter, especially, a split stance is quite natural to you. But dropping into it and controlling it out of the bottom of the movement and then coming back out of it, it might change the way that you look at jumping actions and say like, wow, this is so different to what I'm used to of just catching at the bottom of a movement and then coming out of it, as opposed to dropping and driving out of it. I think is really quite different. See, to start with, you don't have to be really pernickety with, volumes, the type of movements that you're doing, but just playing around with bilateral stuff is probably going to give you a real bang for your buck when it comes to lifters, especially. And just playing a little bit with movements, like what does it feel to let me stand in this position of a split stance? How does it feel to just kind of oscillate right at the bottom? Just bouncing in and out of it. I'm not leaving the ground. Okay, how does that feel? Right, now I'm going to start to leave the ground. How does it feel to then exchange my legs? Like, what changes? Because when I exchange my legs, I accelerate the limb. And when I accelerate the limb, it spikes the ground reaction force because I'm hitting the ground faster. So you start just in a normal split stance, going up and down, landing and taking off. Okay, cool, relax. Come back to it in a few minutes. Right, now I'm going to exchange. How much has that changed in terms of stability? Because stability is going to be the first thing that's going to be challenged when it comes to increasing the speed of a limb into the floor. And I was just speaking to Chris, doing things like a split jerking action, stability around that front and back leg, when you want to be as fast as possible into the bottom of that action and not have lower leg instability to be the thing that stops you from making the lift is a real big mistake that you can have. Like, don't allow that to be your limiting factor. So that can be a way to teach that. Rather than doing it with a bar, use velocity rather than the extremity of an external force in a bar overhead or whatever. You could just do it with velocity and gravity. And I think that it's just playing like that. Like, you don't have to have a doctorate in plyometrics to try this thing and know the exact rep schemes, because I have no idea what either of you would need in terms of a stimulus. So you have to play. Yeah. You have to play around with, geez, I did 150 landings. That was far too much. But next week, I'm not going to do 150 landings. I'm going to rein it back in 10%, 20%, play around in that zone, maybe add a different movement each week, maybe to the light or the deep tier, and just see how that moves. Play around with some different directions. If I do something lateral in a split stance, are my glutes on absolute fire when I do that? When I move laterally with that front leg move, let's say my right foot's forward, when I move to the right, I know that I have a lot of athletes that complain to me the next day because of the sort of DOMs that you're getting, because of the pull that you have on that limb. So it's something that you have to play with. It's something that I think is quite playful in nature as well. I know that guys just like to jump around, move around effectively. And I think play can ultimately be a really great guide of your program too.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I think when it comes to functional fitness in particular, like, notice when someone's trying to learn, say, double unders, they go from barely doing any plyometric, and obviously where that is in your spectrum, that they go from doing pretty much zero jumping to practicing loads of volume at one go, and then end up with obviously like sore calves and like potentially other injuries and stuff. And I think I guess with like most things, and like we discussed on the podcast a lot, it's all about that dosage and then reviewing what you've done, how you felt, and if you actually need to taper back a little bit, or actually go in a little bit less than you think. Let me just do a little bit and do a little bit more, just like classic progressive overload. So, but I really like the idea of putting it in play where it's not an actual thing and you're not thinking about how many reps or this. You're just moving through flow, which is always a nice way to expose the body. One, to obviously like that, the ground reaction force, but also just to positions in general. I think like having a kid, you see it, and like, I guess with yours, especially when you start to go into like playgrounds and stuff like that, you've got to get into small gaps and small holes, and you're putting your body now into new positions, and you're like, oh my God, I haven't been this low in a long time. So it's a really cool way. Like, I think for myself, who, not going to lie, like, I barely do any plyometric stuff at all, and I'm more like powerlifting. Like, I think since I've done CrossFit, since I haven't done that in a while, that was probably the last sort of plyometric stuff I did, maybe the odd jump here and there. So you're just talking to you now, I'm just thinking like, how much would that, because I'm naturally quite a powerful person out the hole. I've never really had to think, cool, I need to be better at this. But I'm now thinking just like, how much more could I actually extrapolate out to get more power out? And it's cool.
I think it's a major injury mechanism for gym people going back into sport is that they do zero plyometric and they develop huge amounts of force generation in static positions, and then parts of their body are incredibly strong, but then like the tendinous areas are not. So when you try and cut or change direction very quickly in that five-a-side game for the first time in 2 years, shit snaps. And it's not that surprising, which is one of the reasons why I think plyometric, like in terms of actual general physical preparedness, you must have plyometrics in to be able to run at the drop of a hat and change direction and stuff like that.
Yeah, and just before I was going to say, before we move on, there's such a big part of, let's say you've gained 5 or 10 kg since you've last played. The difference, like we always use the phrase that like fat doesn't fly, nor does extra muscle weight, because your tendon now has to deal with that much more. Because let's say you've gained 15 kg. Well, that's an enormous percentage of your overall body weight. And when you're doing things at 5 or 6 times body weight already, well, that becomes exponential. It's not just that 10 or 15 kg, like when you're standing there at 1 times body weight. Well, you do something at 5 times, well, that straight away becomes more than 60, 70 kg. And you're like, oh, okay, if I would have done that, I'll just put 50, 60, 70 kg on the top of my 1RM back squat. No chance.
Yeah.
So we expect that to adapt straight away, and you're like, no, you're not doing the thing. So don't go back to doing it without I've done the background work with it.
Spot on.
It's exactly
through spaces.
Sorry, just
go on, Rob.
Yeah, no, it's exactly when I so since then completing the powerlifting prep, I started to introduce running back into my training. But rather than what I used to do, I would just go bang, here we go. I actually thought, do you know what? I'm going to start with 400 meters and just see how my body holds up. Then 800 meters, and I was actually more considerate of like the stress on my body, because exactly what you said there, I am a bit heavier now. And I was just thinking, cool, that amount of force and stress going through my joints, I'm taking a lot more consideration into the tendons and the just general overall well-being of my body compared to as my aerobic base. Like, forget that. I can just trudge through something. But then the actual sheer stress of going through, say, like running now, of that as a constant, obviously, plyometric nature, that my body I've had to just introduce it nice and steadily. And it's definitely made a difference compared to, say, an old mindset of just say, right, I'm going to go bang, let's go 5K. I know I used to be able to do 5K, so that's where I'm going to start.
Yeah, I think that people don't appreciate that moving in the sense of transporting your body is a body weight exercise. So you're always carrying your mass wherever you go. And if you're not respecting that, like you are there, Rob, the maths on it is frightening when you think about how many times you're contacting the ground. If you're changing direction, the forces can be even greater. And yeah, it's astonishing how significant that is to most people. One question I wanted to go back to, Matt, when you were talking about the difference between skipping and plyometric, was the full foot force versus forefoot landing. Could you talk us through that in a little bit more detail, please?
Yeah, so the position of the foot, and I always roll back to, you have to think about the most effective way to stabilize the foot when you land. So if I land with my forefoot, 99% of the population will land forefoot, they'll drop the heel to the floor, then they stabilize, then they transfer the force, and then they come off of the toe. So when we land in a more forefoot position, when I talk about forefoot, the aim is to land kind of behind the ball of the foot. There's like a tickle spot in there that kind of sits at the front of the plantar fascia. And it might be that your heel you can slot a credit card underneath your heel. It might just be off the floor, but you'll drop down, you'll contact, and then you'll be able to leave off of the toe. And that kind of is my way of coaching it, is to get athletes to land in a more of a forefoot action so that they can move through the foot quicker with the landing and takeoff portion of a plyometric. So I want to make sure that if we're coaching athletes is geared towards maximizing stability straight away, so that we can impart force quicker rather than trying to find stability. I always use that, like, you're looking for stability in this given movement, and the reason is because either the landing mechanics or you just can't handle that force at that speed. 99% of the time when landing mechanics come into it, it's because of the position on the foot and how they move through the foot.
And why is it that tickle spot is so much more stable than landing more towards the toe like people would in skipping?
I mean, it does go back to them having to drop the heel down to stabilize on a flat foot, because we're not built like a cat. We don't land well on our hind foot. Well, and a cat does well to land on their hind foot because they have two more additional stability points with their front feet as well. We don't have the opportunity to do that, especially when we're moving on one leg. Like, you're going to stabilize your whole body on this small portion of your forefoot, keep your heel off the ground, and move off of it. The likelihood is no. And in typical movement gait, you have to go through supination to then move into pronation as you leave off of the big toe. So when you're up on your forefoot, you can't move into supination and roll through into pronation as effectively. So landing on a full foot allows you to do that and allows you to impart force at the right given moment, and not negate the use of the big toe, which I think is a really important factor that a lot of people don't take into consideration when they're coaching as well.
Brilliant. And is this why a lot of running drills involve the toes up cue to try and create the same landing mechanic?
Yeah, you're trying to maximize where you're about to land. So going back to those points, when I have toes up, my aim then is to think about how I can then snap that foot into position when I come into contact with the ground. And the second part of that action of toes up is I focus on toes up, then toes down. So we have an active striking of the foot underneath the hip, so that it's not toes up, thud, hit the ground, and wait for it, but we have that action of kind of flexion into extension. And that's ultimately where we generate a little bit more velocity and a faster stabilizing effect and a greater transfer of energy then, because our ground contact time is faster.
Amazing. That's awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that. One other question I think a lot of the listeners will appreciate you answering is how plyometrics carry over to maximal strength efforts. So doing the deep work and even the overcoming sort of maximum force stuff in terms of muscle activation and force generation. How does that carry over? Because I think people don't appreciate the benefit of, you see a lot of jumpers come into the weight room having never lifted and they've got massive power cleans just innately, and I think a lot of it's to do with this plyometric style training. Could you explain how that works, please?
I mean, the example that I always love to throw around is Jonathan Edwards, the world record holder in the triple jump, weighed 72 kg and had a 140 kg bench press and didn't particularly train for the bench. It was like when you train the ability of the body to be as dynamic as possible and to be as snappy and fast as possible, you tend to be able to generate speed and force so fast that, I mean, you can almost guarantee that the lift was probably like drop down to your chest as fast as you possibly can and throw that thing back up as fast as you can. And that's the tendency of that athlete to be like that. And it's probably the same as when you watch a really effective sprinter or jumper. When they clean, they'll catch it in a high position, like a power clean position, and they'll just bounce it then off of their chest. They won't want to catch it, but you know that they'll just chuck it up there. And it is the ability to pull on the tendon and get energy out of it, no matter kind of what the scenario looks like. Obviously, you need velocity to generate that pull on the tendon from the muscle. But I think that when you've trained that ability, you can call upon the tendon a little bit better than the person that's not doing that dynamic stuff. So you go, I need strength right now and I need it quick. So I'm going to yank on that tendon and that tendon's going to give me some snapback. And ultimately the density of muscle for jumpers and people that do a lot of plyometrics, the belly of the muscle is just so dense in comparison to, let's say, a bodybuilder. There's so much more kind of loose water in that area as opposed to the density of that muscle. And like you said, the neurological side comes in the ability to recruit much higher muscle fiber types as well, that again tend to be faster twitch. They tend to be able to fire quicker in a larger group all together at the right time. And athletes are effective at doing that rather than just having the ability to do, let's say, just a basic lift, which doesn't require a lot of skill, just to pull something or push something. When you're able to switch things on and off at great rates, at really high amplitudes and real quick timing, then you are really good at doing that. I mean, I don't know any data on it, but I'd like to see the differences between something like, let's say, an Olympic lifter pulling a weight off of the floor as opposed to like a jumper or a sprinter. And I'd like to see the EMG readings in terms of like the pre-activation of those muscles, because I can guarantee you that the jumper, the rate in which they do that would be like, would be so quick and high. And I can almost bet you that the activation numbers as opposed to kind of maximal voluntary contraction would be very high as well in terms of percentage, because we have the data to suggest that when we come in to hit the ground with doing plyos with world-class jumpers. So those are some of the whys, I think, behind why these guys just rock up and can just throw things around without even training for them.
Exactly. And I think the speed component is massively underappreciated. One question I have for you is tempo work. I see the value of tempo work for bodybuilding and hypertrophy, but I think it's massively overvalued in terms of performance and actual strength gain. What's your thought on doing a slow negative with a pause and then coming out the hole?
Yeah, there are certain times I think when you need opposing training methods. Charlie Francis, one of the best sprints coaches in the world, who coached Ben Johnson, who unfortunately was done for cheating, but he used a lot of opposing methods of high and low days, where you are having real high neuromuscular hitting days as opposed to very low neuromuscular depleting days. So I kind of like that opposing nature, and that's why I have the deep tier stuff in there. But obviously there are still very similar tendencies to those movements to do things like pauses or tempos. When it comes to lifting, I think it might have a small part of your program, but the likelihood for it to ever grow is probably quite minimal in terms of its kind of real estate within the program. I don't think it would ever become a larger focus. I just think that it might have a small place within it, and that could be touching upon, a couple of days in a week of a complete macro cycle. You would just do, this week we are going to do some slow tempos and we're just going to switch things on its head. And there could be a little bit of value in that.
Yeah, I think it's why training to go slow at the end of the day, isn't it? Like you're training the body to move slowly. So it's good for hypertrophy because of muscle damage and time under tension. And it's good for building positional awareness. But in terms of actual force generation, I think it's actually counterproductive, which might be an unpopular opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I use tempo work with like my clients and stuff, mainly as after competition or after a peaking phase, one to kind of deload the body, but also then work on the positions like you said there. So they're actually thinking a little bit more about spending a little bit more time, say on a bench press, understanding where that bar's going to get grease in the groove in a much better way rather than say just performing it to say competition standards. So yeah, the fact for me, I use it as essentially like a bit like a deload and say for muscle growth is, it's a nice way to do it.
That's awesome. Yeah. Are there any other controversial points of view or common misconceptions around plyos? I saw you put something up about snap downs recently. Matt, can you talk us through that?
I always come back to it every about 6 weeks. Just chuck something out. Still doesn't make sense. Snap downs don't have a landing component to them, therefore do not spike any real ground reaction force. So using snap downs to prepare you for movements that, a snap down isn't as dynamic or highly intense as basic, like skipping, as if a kid would skip down the road. So why do we do it?
Agree.
That's it. Your point of why would you do slow stuff when you were aiming to be fast? It's kind of in the same nature of things. And the snap down doesn't have the landing positions that I would want someone to land in when they do plyos anyway. So again, the skill parameter comes in there as well, where you're just looking at things and saying, well, that doesn't look the same, so it probably doesn't fit the same. That's where I stand, and I kind of jump on that soapbox every so often and just say, yep, still shit.
Yeah, it's training to be still and not move. Just in great sport. Right, Matt, that's been absolutely phenomenal. I've really enjoyed this and learned a lot, and I think a lot of the listeners will get a ton out of it as well. Could you tell us more, where I'm sure a lot of people are going to have more questions and want to learn more about plyometrics? What's the best way to find out more?
Yeah, so being completely biased, it's come and find me on Instagram. There is, there's a few other guys that do really well, and they coach and educate it really effectively. But books wise, it's pretty abysmal unless you want to read German, want to read Russian literature. Which, if you don't have the scientific background of things, I wouldn't suggest going there, because it can be quite difficult to get your head into. But finding me on Instagram, and it's McInnes Watson, McInnesWatson, or at +Plyos, which is our plyometric business. But on my personal Instagram, like within my links, I've got so many episodes from other podcasts where I've been in kind of different domains, whether it's within the basketball domain, whether it's in strength conditioning, looking at tendons specifically within the rehab sector as well. There are different approaches that I've kind of looked at in terms of podcasts. I've written blogs for Simply Faster as well, which are great to dig into. Goes into a lot more detail as to some of the subjects that we've spoken about today. And on our website plusplyos.com, we have a course on the introduction of coaching plyometrics, and we have a few resources, as well as umpteen amount of programs within our subscription service. And over the next coming few months, I'm going to kind of look to bring out a bit more of another course or a mentorship as it is as well. So always ask me a question over Instagram. I'm more than happy to do that. At the moment, I'm kind of really pushing kind of carousel posts where I'm trying to get into some depth of the nuances of different movements and why you shouldn't be using them and so on. So reach out to me. So it's always great to chat to people about this stuff.
Brilliant.
Thank you, mate.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully speak to you again soon.
Cheers, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt, for coming on. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to getting some plyometrics into my training, so seeing how much it improves my power lifts. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. As always, we would love for you to share the message and share the episode with someone that maybe you think it will benefit their training. And I think, as you got from that episode, it kind of benefit everyone. So share it with everyone that you know. We would really appreciate that. If you want to support the podcast, you can head over to YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Lunge Lift, or you can head over to Instagram at lunge.lift and hit us up with any questions or any subjects that you want us to cover. But really hope you have a great Christmas, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.